The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
Gay marriage and immigration are two of today's most contentious social topics. How do these hot-button issues intersect? We'll examine their connection next, during office hours. Hi, I'm Ken Goldstein, Professor of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today we're taking a look at the politics of immigration and the politics of sexuality. Joining me is Chávez, Professor in the Department of Communication Arts at UW-Madison and co-founder of the Queer Migration Research Network. In addition to her expertise on immigration social movements, her current research explores the intersections of immigration and sexuality. Karma, welcome to Office Hours.
Thank you.
Let me start with, in some ways, I think what might be the obvious question. It may not be so clear to our viewers right off the bat what the connection is between immigration politics, immigration policy, and sexual politics or marriage policy. Take me through that a little bit.
Well, I think it occurs on a number of levels. So, for one, sexuality, particularly non-heterosexuality, has always been a reason for excluding immigrants from coming to the United States, and most of my research is centered in the United States.
Let me interrupt you for a second
Sure.
there. I'm sorry, but I didn't realize until we were preparing for this that it was actually until 1990 illegal to immigrate to the United States if you were gay, lesbian.
Yeah, the law was in place until 1990, and it had a lot of transformations in between really 1917, when it sort of became formalized in a manner of speaking, until 1990, and then even so, there's still moral turpitude. So if you might be accused of that, which sometimes being gay or lesbian can lead to that, you still might be able to be excluded. And then, of course, the HIV ban for law, which actually was just repealed in January of 2010.
Okay. So, again, before I rudely interrupted you, back to that connection
Sure.
between the two.
Sure. So for one, there's this issue of exclusion. For another, a lot of what my research looks at is social movements and coalition building. And there are a lot of similarities in the ways that migrants get demonized and the way that LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people get demonized whenever, economics are bad. These two groups get positioned sort of in similar ways. And that's one of the things I look at, is how those positions happen, and then also how coalition building might happen between immigration rights activists and gay rights activists. Not to mention, there are a lot of gay immigrants who can't unify or can't come to the United States, for example, under family reunification laws that currently benefit heterosexual married couples. And so there are a lot of intersections that you might not think about when thinking about these two issues.
So we really sort of have two areas. One is in the realm of politics, when these two groups might be similarly targeted or come together on certain issues. And then we have a second one, which is more of the personal or the family stories. We'll get to that latter one later on. But I think one way to understand that is the very interesting case of what happened in Arizona in 2006. So you went to graduate school at Arizona State, so you were perfectly situated to experience a state that was having both a referendum election for one of these defensive marriage referenda, and also has become very much the center of immigration politics, especially recently with the Arizona immigration law. Tell me the story of that 2006 Protect Marriage Act campaign.
Sure. So I was doing my dissertation research at the time, and I was researching with a couple of organizations in Tucson. One is Coalición de Derechos Humanos, is an immigrant rights group, and then Wingspan, which is Southern Arizona's LGBT rights center. And during that time, when I was starting to do my research, there was Prop 107, which was called Protect Marriage Arizona, going to be up for a vote, which would have written into the Arizona Constitution that marriage can only be between a man and a woman, and it also would have basically outlawed domestic partner benefits for state employees. Also at that time, there were 4 bills or 4 referenda that were targeting immigrant rights, and so an English-only bill, one that would have not allowed for immigrants to have bail, one that also was, it was basically designed to not allow immigrants to have in-state tuition, undocumented immigrants to have in-state tuition, or to receive like Head Start programs and those kinds of things. And then there's one other, which I always forget that one. But in any case, the Protect Marriage Arizona, people thought they could win Arizona, and all the states up to that point had passed these Defense of Marriage Acts overwhelmingly. And so there was this group called Arizona Together, led by Kyrsten Sinema, who is the only out bisexual woman in the state legislature in the state of Arizona, also a big immigrant rights activist. But she led up Arizona Together, and really the way that Arizona Together used or created their campaign was largely premised on the fact that gays weren't as bad as immigrants. At least that's the argument that I make. And I think essentially what happened is all 4 of these bills against undocumented immigrants overwhelmingly passed. Meanwhile, it was the first time that one of these Defense of Marriage Acts didn't actually pass. Of course, 2 years later, there were no immigration referenda on the ballot, and there was another Defense of Marriage Act, and it did in fact pass then in 2008.
We're going to come back and talk about this, but it's really a very interesting time. So I think that was the only Defense of Marriage Act that did not pass, using the terms. And there was 28 states, and Arizona, which one wouldn't normally think of to be the first one to defeat it, defeats it. We'll continue our discussion of that and go behind the scenes with the intersection of the politics of immigration and the politics of sexuality with Karma Chávez. Please stay with us on Office Hours.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Where others saw lumber, we recognized a treasure. Where others saw the night, we chose the stars. Where others saw pieces, we unlocked the puzzle that could mean the end of paralysis and cancer. Since 1848, thinkers and achievers at Wisconsin have fearlessly sought ideas that transform the world. Keep on, Wisconsin. Keep on.
Welcome back to Office Hours. We're with Karma Chávez from the Department of Communication Arts here at UW-Madison, and we were talking about the politics of immigration, the politics of sexuality. So we were talking about this 2006 Arizona election. It's this defeat of the amendment, and one would think this is a big victory for gay rights organizations. And I'm sitting down to read your article about this, and it tells this story, and it tells about how the referendum is defeated, and I know a little bit more about your research, and I'm thinking this is going to be a big celebratory article, but it's not. You're highly critical of the way the campaign was waged that defeated this. Why?
Well, I think in large part the reason why I'm critical of this is because it relied on sort of the age-old divide and conquer type of politics. And so Arizona Together's campaign hardly included any people of color, and in fact, it hardly included any gay people, even though it was an amendment that was primarily going to impact gays and lesbians.
But you said like one of the major ads was an older white couple in their 70s or 80s living together.
Yeah, an older white straight couple. These were the poster children for this campaign, and basically gays and lesbians were sort of left out in a way. So one, it didn't actually focus on gays and lesbians, but when it did, gays were always figured as not quite as scary as immigrants. And in fact, in 2008, when the same group was in charge of the campaign again for the new amendment, Prop 102 in 2008, they actually explicitly said that gay marriage isn't nearly as important as issues that we have to be concerned with, like illegal immigration. And so even though it wasn't overtly stated in 2006, it was all over the website, all over the campaign material. And I thought it was problematic because there were people in Tucson, for example, who were really trying not to run that kind of campaign, that were actually trying to build coalitions. Now, they might have lost if they had followed that, the route of Tucson.
So let's talk about that as someone who studies social movements and maybe does a little social movements as well.
Sure.
So I study politics, I study campaigns and elections. In previous lives, I've done political consulting. So I'm reading this quote from Kyrsten Sinema, who was the head of the campaign and who you interviewed. And she says things like, we weren't asking them to go out on a limb and touch a place that was raw or new for them. We just told them that where they were right now was okay, and where they were right now was to vote no, and then help them understand in their words why a no vote was the right thing to do here, without asking them to stand up and support full marriage rights because they're not there yet.
Sure.
So I'm sitting there looking at that, goes, well, seems pretty strong political advice.
Absolutely. And I think it was very expedient in the moment. And I think one of the reasons it was so expedient was because everyone was freaked out about immigration. Everyone was concerned that immigrants were taking over the state. We heard every day new numbers about all the things that immigrants were doing wrong. This was right at the time when the Minutemen had just launched in Tombstone, Arizona in 2005. So there was a lot of fervor. And so in a way, yeah, it was politically expedient because people could buy sort of the fact that we didn't want this old straight couple to lose their benefits.
But make more explicit to me that connection of
Sure.
how you think the campaign essentially demonized immigrants. So there's this other quote from Kristen, so she's not saying we're going to demonize immigrants here, but she says, we all sat down to look at one of our polls and we said, well, the good news is that people hate Mexicans a lot more than they hate us. Why was that good news for her?
Well, I think in large part, that's how politics works, right? So if there's someone who's more hated than you, or if there's an issue that's more of a hot button issue than yours, for sure that's going to help your case, even if you're not explicitly saying, well, we're against illegal immigration too. In a state when it's all over the news every day, to not take a position on it, and also not to even include gay people or gay immigrants in the campaign at all, I think it was an implicit sort of message. So my analysis of the campaign really is sort of by what's absent more than maybe what's present. But I do think, I mean, I was following in large part the analysis of people that I was working with in Tucson who had a very different approach. And actually in Tucson, where they had a very different approach, if I'm remembering the polls correctly, it was in Tucson where the gap was much wider in terms of people actually not upholding Prop 107. So, I mean, you could speculate on one way or the other, but I just think that because immigration was such a big deal, and the only other issue that was creating fervor was gay rights, that there was some relationship between the two of them.
Please stay with us on Office Hours. We're discussing the politics of immigration, the politics of sexuality, and we're going to come back and discuss how there can be difficulties with different alliances when it comes to these two issues. Please stay with us.
Great People is our campaign for need-based scholarship aid. It's the key to the long-term well-being of the university as a whole.
In 1970, tuition cost about $500.
Today, it's about $9,000.
We don't want UW-Madison to be a university that is deemed to be out of reach.
The Great People Scholarship gives students a chance to succeed in life.
Support the Great People Scholarship. Visit uwgreatpeople.org.
Welcome back to Office Hours. Joining me is Karma Chávez from the Department of Communication Arts here at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Karma, as different organizations are going about either advocating for domestic partnership benefits or gay marriage or immigration reform, you have groups that may be together on one thing, not together at all on this other. And so those same sort of hard decisions that were made in 2006 in Arizona are also being made now as there are political battles for immigration reform. So the National Hispanic Christian Leadership Coalition, which I believe is the largest Latino organization in the country, 16 million members, their leader says same-sex is a death knell for immigration reform. Kevin Appleby of the U.S. Conference of Bishops, Catholic bishops, been very supportive of immigration reform. Immigration is hard enough without adding same-sex to the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is one of the challenges because the religious community has come out so much in support of immigrant rights at the same time that they've been very, not all of them, but the Catholics, for example, have primarily been against same-sex rights. And I think what's interesting about this is that the same reason why the Catholics are really in support of immigrants is exactly why they oppose gays. So it's all about family values. It's the idea that immigrants are hard workers, they're Catholic, they come here in male-female marriages, and they're going to promote the vision of family values that the church wants. Meanwhile, gay and lesbian marriage or the existence of gays and lesbians at all is completely contrary, and so they sort of rupture everything the church believes about family values. So I think it is one of these huge issues that puts these two groups almost at odds. And yet, of course, not all immigrants are great on family values, and a lot of gays and lesbians really just want to be like straight people, right?
And almost at odds is also underplaying it a little bit, right? So you have one group who sees both as civil rights issues, and one group that only sees one as a civil rights issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's part of the problem with the civil rights frame, of course, is I like to think of both issues more in terms of human rights, and as
what's the difference between human rights and civil rights?
Well, I think in large part the gay and lesbian rights movement has been about civil rights, and so wanting access to civil marriage, wanting access to be able to serve openly in the military, and then even in terms of immigration, so the Uniting American Families Act, which essentially would change the Immigration and Nationality Act from the word spouse to permanent partner, I believe is the way the language would be written, so that you could sponsor your same-sex partner. I mean, all of these are essentially about civil issues. They're not so much about transgender homelessness, youth suicide, the fact that people still can be legally fired from their jobs in most states for being LGBT. To me, those are maybe more human rights issues where people aren't able to sustain themselves. And immigration is inherently more of a human rights issue because you're talking about international migration and international law.
And there's not only tension among leadership and organizations, but in the community as well. So some exit poll data from Wisconsin in 2006. Latino voters broke even on this. African American voters, generally left of center voters, overwhelmingly Democratic voters, overwhelmingly supported the marriage amendment. And if we look at the 2008 marriage amendment in California, that basically won because Barack Obama ran for president. There was huge African American turnout in California, and they voted for the Defense of Marriage amendment that was in California. Very interesting, not only among the leadership, but in the community.
Absolutely. Well, and I think what's interesting, and I'm going to frame both your Wisconsin data and also California as failures of the LGBT rights movement. Because I think what happens is all of the mainstream leaders are white. They're middle class, they're in sort of heteronormative couples, and they're not targeting the African American community at all. In fact, there's a lot of racism in the LGBT rights movement, and people like Urvashi Vaid have written extensively about this. And so, in large part, it's hard to blame
That's an important thought. So let me interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
We got to kick to commercial, and I want to have you continue with that when we come back. So please stay with us when we come back to Office Hours.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Welcome back to Office Hours with Karma Chávez from the Department of Communication Arts at UW-Madison. So Karma, in the end of that last segment, you made a pretty provocative statement, which you thought many members of the lesbian, gay, social movement organizations can sometimes be racist.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they're racist in the sense that they hate people of color, but I think there's a way in which the community targets primarily white middle-class people, whether that's the straight people we're trying to persuade, excuse me, or whether it's other gays and lesbians in terms of representation. In California, for example, there was very little outreach to the black community, or to any communities of color, really. So in some ways, it makes sense why people who weren't educated voted the ways that they did. I don't think it's that, blacks are more racist, or rather more homophobic than whites or anybody else, but I do think that they haven't been a part of the message of the LGBT rights movement.
Let's turn now in our last couple minutes to immigration policy at a more a couple level,
Sure.
if you will. So apparently there's 11,000 couples in the United States that are lesbian or gay couples in which the partner is not a U.S. citizen. Nitty gritty, why is that a problem for these people?
Well, there's a number of people who simply can't sponsor their partner for immigration. So if you're a heterosexual married couple, and in fact, even if you're engaged, you can sponsor your foreign national partner. If you're gay or lesbian, you can't do that. And so this creates a lot of hardship. People trying to sometimes live undocumented finding residence in another country, you know, scam marriages, all sorts of things just to kind of get around it and be able to be together. And it affects a lot of people. Of course, it's one small issue when it comes to immigration and sexuality together. In large part, we could broaden out family reunification laws way more than just same-sex couples, and we could define family in a lot broader ways so that cousins could sponsor or friends could sponsor, and it wouldn't have to be about sort of this family unit that depends on a couple. There's a great statement by Queers for Economic Justice called Queers and Immigration, a Vision Statement, and they map out a really pretty cool statement that includes the benefits for same-sex couples who happen to be binational, but also it creates a broader vision for how these two issues might be thought in relation to each other.
So I'm smiling because I think you were channeling a little political consultant here, because you were saying, hey, I want to solve this problem, and okay, we're not going to deal with gay marriage. We'll just say, okay, your friend can sponsor you. So if I was Christine Sinema, who said, you just wrote this article saying I was being pragmatic, and she heard you say this?
I mean, there's a way in which, I don't know if it's necessarily pragmatic or if just sort of trying to rupture how we understand family. Because even if, whether it's gay marriage or whether it's reunification rights for same-sex couples, it's still premised on a very narrow definition of family. And you know, all our health care benefits and things like that are also premised on a very narrow definition of family, and it doesn't always serve that many people. And so maybe it's a little bit political, but it's also that I think that there are other ways we could be framing these issues that we're not.
And more generally, the politics of immigration, or not the politics of immigration, but the family situations of immigration are a lot about reuniting these families. Absolutely. And enabling people to stay more together in a cohesive unit. Absolutely.
I think it was in 1965 where immigration laws changed very significantly. And I believe it was in 1965 that about 74% then of immigration to the United States was to create family reunification. So sort of the heteropatriarchal family bringing each other to the United States, which is great in a lot of ways, and I'm not against family reunification at all, but it does leave out a lot of people.
Karma, thank you so much for joining us on Office Hours. I hope you'll come back and we have a further discussion. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Don't forget, Office Hours is on the web via our university website, Facebook, or even Twitter. Take a look and let us know your thoughts. From the University of Wisconsin-Madison, this has been Office Hours. Thanks for stopping by.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.